in the position that I held. And I'm going to go as close to the wind as I can there. We won't name names, obviously, but you'll get a pretty good idea of just how the thing looks from close up by the time I finish speaking. If we do go over the line, I'm sure, Norman, you've got your liability insurance all up to date, so that'll all be fine.
Joy to ring the bell prematurely.
Yeah, ring it now. Okay, let's talk about the political debate, which I'd say has been a bit spurious. It's that way because it's been largely about debt. The government has said, look, we'd like to keep debt down, we'd like to keep it below 30% of GDP. We don't want to borrow, etc., etc. It's also pointed out that the dividend flow that it's getting from the MOM companies is lower than its cost of borrowing. Therefore, an operating balance sense, it's going to be better off by realising the assets. What that ignores, of course, is that the earnings of the companies are somewhat larger than just their dividends. Not to be outdone, the opposition have published figures that have suggested that if the Crown were to sell all of its equity, the cost to the Crown would actually be greater than the combined earnings of all the MOM companies put together, which is quite an achievement. That was just a simple error in their calculation. More sensible analysis would say, look, what the Crown is doing here is exchanging a risky asset for a less risky asset. So yes, there should be a fiscal cost. It should be equal to the risk premium between the two of them, and in risk-adjusted terms, not a lot has changed. So what we've had is a political debate which has been dubious in nature and essentially about the wrong issues, and you may well think that's par for the course here in New Zealand. As a segue to the major issues, I'm going to talk about a couple of things before we get on to the real issue, which is just how is it going to impact on the way those operations work and the way we use our resources here in New Zealand. I'd like to talk about the impact it will have on the Crown balance sheet and a few issues about sovereignty as well. In terms of the first one of the concerns we have is that in undertaking mixed ownership, we're somehow robbing the next generation of taxpayers, that we're going to leave them with fewer assets and less income than they would otherwise have had, and they'll be worse off as a result of that. Now, in fact, when you look at the Crown balance sheet, you just find that just isn't so, and in fact, the truth is pretty much 180 degrees the other way. Just looking at the way the balance sheet has evolved in recent years, we've got some summary numbers here. You'll see that total assets over the last decade have increased by about $140 billion. A big part of that has been the increase in investments, that's securities, shares, derivatives, those kinds of things. They've gone up by about $40 billion during that time. And as a percentage of GDP, the lift has been about 42% over the decade. In today's dollars, that's worth about $85 billion. Okay, that's how much the Crown has grown its asset base during that time. Which raises an obvious question, that is, why on earth are we having this debate? What is so special about the $6 billion of assets that is going one way, and we're completely ignoring the $80 billion that's gone the other way? And I think this is perhaps a bit of a hint of the recurring governance problems that we tend to have in the public sector, and that what gets attention is the things that create headlines or clash with ideologies or just oily wheels that need squeaking, and the attention on what really matters tends to be kind of hidden and sort of stays below the surface and doesn't really get the debate that it ought to. Looking ahead, the sort of rate of Crown accumulation shows no sign of slowing either. If we look at the government's investment statement that are put out, it shows that over the next rolling 4-year period, in gross terms, we'll be accumulating about another $70 billion worth of assets during that time. So again, MOM stuff is a drop in the bucket going the other way. Majority of what it's accumulating is property, plant and equipment and commercial investments along the way. We hear a lot of angst about state asset sales here. Frankly, I think a coalition against state asset purchases would make a great deal more sense, given the way the momentum is going. Just a few words too about the sovereignty issues. People are nervous about foreign ownership, and again I think the numbers may surprise here. Got some numbers here pulled from stats just looking at external assets and liabilities that New Zealanders hold. Basic point here is that in terms of equity investment, the position is actually surprisingly balanced. New Zealanders own about as much overseas as foreigners own here in New Zealand. It's about $60 billion in each case, and it's been sort of stable-ish for a few years now. It's true that we do have big negative net foreign liabilities. That's largely a debt issue. It reflects the national savings investment decisions that have been made. It does give us concerns about macro stability from time to time, but we should recognise that the equity flows that come out of that are a consequence of the national savings position. They're not the actual driver behind it. To put a bit of it in context, my own organisation, ACC Investments, over the last 4 years has purchased in the order of $10 billion worth of foreign assets. That's considerably more than the MOM company worth put together, 50% of them is worth put together. It's a multiple of what foreigners are likely to end up owning in those as well, but again it gets no headlines. I think the basic lesson we take out of this is that New Zealanders are continually saving, investing and getting to those kinds of transactions with the rest of the world. What's really important is that we get the quality decision making in there, that we get the stream going right, and worrying about individual bits and pieces because they happen to be visible is kind of futile at best. Let's move on to the kind of evidence about why ownership matters. I'm going to actually speed up this because it seems I'm getting behind time already. A lot of this debate tends to be very partisan. It's kind of hard to find objective analysis. So I'm going to kind of cast the thing in a framework that was used by a World Bank review. And they asked 3 questions. They said, look, the debate comes down to, do you think that competition matters more than ownership, or is it just a case of getting your markets genuinely competitive and then you can let firms operate and you're fine? Are SOEs subject to welfare reducing interventions, and are SOE government problems intractable? On the first issue there, that's a topic in itself, and I'm not going to go into it today other than to say the weight of evidence is against it. Yes, the two are reinforcing. Yes, competitive markets matter, but in competitive markets, ownership probably matters more than in markets that are less competitive, actually. The second area of debate is how the governments actually behave with respect to these SOEs, and Lew talked about some of the agency problems that we have. You as diffuse owners actually have in influencing and understanding what's going on there. Advocates of public ownership would argue there's a whole range of ancillary benefits that go with ownership. This is things like economic development, being able to develop critical mass in your local markets, being a supplier of risk capital, all those kinds of things. They sound seductive, but in truth they're actually dangerous. And they're dangerous because they're subject to the standard public interest critiques, which says somebody along the way will always subvert those things for their own local agenda. As long as you have asymmetric information, principal agency problems, all those other kinds of issues, they'll get kind of distorted and used in ways that are ones that we don't particularly want. Just to pick out one example, politicians have a natural tendency to focus on optimising consumer surplus rather than optimising economic surplus. If you think about electricity markets, we've had a lot of angst about electricity prices in recent years. Where has been the comparable angst where publicly owned operations have failed to deliver and have lost value for taxpayers over time, which is every bit as much a cost to the public. It's just that it's hidden away and you never sort of see anything about it. And politicians are quite rational in the way they respond to that, and it's just a sort of nature in the nature of public ownership, I think. The third and most important part of the debate up there is whether corporate governance problems are themselves inherently insoluble. And the short answer there is yes. Again, Lew talked about some of the reasons. The simple fact is that if you're a manager within a public sector organisation, you know that you're not going to be allowed to go bankrupt. We've seen Transrail Air New Zealand bailed out to date. You know that you're not going to be allowed to be taken over. You know that somebody else who's got a better business plan or is just straight out more competent is not going to come along and kind of take your job, and that induces all the kinds of behaviour that you would expect. In terms of the evidence of how much difference this makes, again, I'm going to have to skip very quickly through this. The study that I was referring to earlier, Shirley and Walsh, completed what's called a meta-analysis, which is kind of a study of studies, if you like, on this. And they looked at a whole lot of, they looked at studies that had measured firm efficiency, either based on ability to control costs or to lift productivity within the firm. And they asked, how many studies show privatised firms are operating better versus how many show you that SOEs are operating better, and the results are pretty clear up there, as you can see. Even when you adjust for industry factors, so you're trying to get like for like, you still get an 18-5 margin. When they looked at firms before and after privatisation, it's a whitewash, as you can see, 14-0 up there. Another review, which is Megason and Netter, asked, well, how large are the actual benefits here? And they again looked at did a sort of study of studies, and they looked at a whole lot of measures, their productivity, efficiency, investment, and so on and so forth. And they found pretty strong gains in output efficiency, profitability, and especially in dividends paid by firms as they'd been through the privatisation process. They found that employment was essentially unchanged, and investment was sort of a moderate influence, as you can see there. Now, just standing back and looking at these results for a moment, you can see where the different attitudes of labour versus capital come from in this debate and why it's as vociferous as it is, I think. If I was a Labour advocate, you'd sort of say, well, this is fine for you guys. You're getting more output, more profits, more dividends, etc. But there's no extra employment being generated. What's in this for us? Why on earth should we buy into and back this kind of process? And I think the answer to that is that there's a lot of indirect benefits for labour that are in there. Some of the outputs that SOEs produce get used as intermediate inputs into the rest of the economy. I mean, let's face it, every business in New Zealand faces power bills. Every business has to pay ACC levies. And having an inefficient state sector essentially just throws an extra kind of burden of cost onto all those other sectors. It lowers their competitiveness and ultimately kind of costs the output in jobs. Now, again, those effects are very real. You can make quite a case that that's been a big problem in the economic slowdown we've had in New Zealand in the last decade. But because it's not particularly visible, it kind of tends to get hidden away and happens sort of subterraneously. Let's sort of return to New Zealand now, kind of talk about some of the experiences that we've seen here. We've had this model in place for 2 decades. You know, it's sort of reasonably well worn in, if you like. The question is, are the sort of benefits we're likely to see here in New Zealand greater or smaller than what the international evidence would suggest to us? Well, here's a few sort of first-hand observations, and I'll just go through them, and you can kind of be the judge as to how well the system's operating here in New Zealand. On entering government, one naturally assumes that as the largest asset owner in the country, with 60-odd billion of commercial investments and a couple $100 billion of total investments, furthermore we're investing some tens of billions of dollars every year, that the asset management and the governance processes would be reasonably well established and firm and clear and operating kind of quite smoothly. But here's a sample of experiences, and they start off with monitoring by the owner, which I think we all agree is important. I mean, early on, the government asked a really radical question. It asked, so what returns have we actually received on the SOEs while we've owned them? This kind of created blank looks on the part of the officials that were monitoring the things. They clearly weren't used to being asked this question, and none of the reports that I saw actually ever mentioned what the stakeholder returns had been. Furthermore, nobody actually knew how to find the answer to that. There was a lot of monitoring that went on about complying with no surprises policies, making sure that ministers weren't surprised by headlines that hit them in the newspapers that they weren't expecting, and making sure that nothing happened that was going to kind of compromise social policy, but commercial side of it really didn't happen. I was astounded to see early on a Treasury report arguing that most SOEs should aim for the lowest possible investment grade credit rating. Did this come from any kind of rational analysis of optimal capital structures and agency costs of debt versus equity, and thinking about how they should gear themselves? Hell no, it didn't. What it said was that we know as equity owners we, the Crown, are really useless at operating companies. Therefore, we should rely on debt markets to do it as much as possible. And the more they gear themselves up, the more work the debt markets will do, and the less our inadequacies will be exposed. I did actually seriously wonder if that was an April Fool's joke, that report, by the way, but no, it wasn't. It was real. It doesn't just apply to the SOEs. It was apparent right across the public sector. It was pretty quickly clear that the Crown had little idea of where its capital was currently employed, where more or less might be needed, what funding was in place, what was likely to be spent in the near future, let alone what returns were being generated. As a result, the process for allocating capital was pretty ad hoc. Where it really got interesting, though, was when we looked at what happened, the way the various entities responded once they realised that the owner had effectively gone AWOL. If you're not a very good horse rider, if you've ever hopped on a horse, the horse figures out pretty quickly whether the whether the rider knows what's going on and kind of takes liberties if they don't. Well, that's a pretty accurate metaphor for the way the SOE sector operates. There was an annual arm wrestle between Treasury and SOE over dividends. The company always argued to retain more capital. While notionally a standard payout ratio applied, this hardly ever was enforced. In the case of the electricity generators, it's interesting that both Trustpower and Contact have been told to exist with the capital they've got. They've had 95% payout rates on average in the last 5 years, although Contact has allowed some dividend reinvestment, has given its owners the option of dividend reinvestment to try to help fund its expansion. Payout ratios were systematically less across the SOEs. One of the SOE chairs, one of the better ones actually we had a lot of respect for, was quite explicit about this. They said, well, look, you know that if we give capital back to you, the Crown, we may not be able to get it back again, so we tend to naturally hoard it, and it was kind of rational in that sense. Which was fair enough. I mean, when SOEs wanted to go beyond just retaining earnings and actually asked for a capital injection, generally confusion reigned. There was certainly no standardised basis for putting in capital requests, having the business case analysed and getting decisions taken.